I'm going to try to go into a little bit more detail. And we talk a lot about biosecurity throughout the whole outbreak response. We're implementing enhanced biosecurity, um, for one, on the actual infected premises, and that's because we want to contain the virus as much as possible. And then we're also encouraging implementation of biosecurity at surrounding farms and premises so that they hopefully don't get that virus introduced into their farm. So going back to some of the goals of the response being containment and prevention of further spread, it all comes back to this biosecurity principles. And thinking about some of the highest risks for avian influenza virus being introduced into a farm or onto a premises, here are a couple of the major ones, which would be personnel who are coming on site or going inside buildings, how disposal of dead birds are managed, sharing equipment, crews, people, and manure management. So these are all things that should really be identified in a biosecurity plan and thought about to hopefully sort of mitigate these risks and decrease the risks for virus introduction. And the link at the bottom goes to a really good website on biosecurity for poultry, as well as how to build a biosecurity plan. So you can go to the next slide. Thinking about biosecurity, again, biosecurity essentially means keeping disease out or preventing further spread of disease. And it can kind of be put into two big categories of structural and operational biosecurity. Structural is really just thinking about the actual construction or design of a facility. So could be if there is fencing around a facility that hopefully would prevent people or other animals from getting in. Just having birds inside a completely enclosed barn. That's an example of structural biosecurity. So those are things that are pretty obvious. We can have a lot of control over. They're pretty fixed ways to do biosecurity. But then the other one is operational. And this is really just the overall practices that are being done to prevent disease introduction or spread. And so really having site-specific plans is really important because even though there are general guidelines for biosecurity, and these can be tailored to different diseases, each farm, each premises is going to be unique and different. And so that's why it's really important to have a site-specific biosecurity plan. And then compliance. So really the best biosecurity plan you can have is the one that can actually be implemented and followed. You could have a very detailed plan written out, but if that message or communication isn't being given to producers, growers, everyday caretakers, people on the ground going on and off of these sites, then it's not doing any good at all. So making sure that the plans can actually be implemented and then verifying that those practices are being followed. Next slide. Sorry, there may just be a little bit of a delay. There we go. So thinking about creating a site-specific biosecurity plan, again, that link at the bottom takes you to a really good website that has really, really good detailed information on how to create a plan. There's an information manual, there are templates, as well as example logs and forms to keep track of people moving off and on a site, other movement logs. And so on the right there, you can kind of see a template or an example of doing a self-assessment checklist for um, a specific site to see how well you're able to address each of these biosecurity concerns. So There is a checklist of 14 standard biosecurity principles. This mirrors the National Poultry Improvement Plan, but these are good for any sort of biosecurity plan. And so these are the 14 different principles, and we're just gonna kind of walk through a little bit more of the details on each of these. So you can go to the next slide. So first and foremost, identifying who is responsible for the biosecurity plan. So making sure to identify a biosecurity coordinator. This is going to be the person that helps develop and implement the plan, oversee document and training, reviewing it, updating it, having that one person to kind of help coordinate the overall biosecurity, but also making sure that it's getting implemented on the ground level. And then they would also be responsible for training, again, doing farm or site-specific training or procedures, in addition to a company-wide or like an area-wide biosecurity plan. It's okay to have sort of an overall company biosecurity plan, but then there should be site-specific ones that, again, go into detail for that farm. You know, what does it look like to implement those practices on that farm? And again, just providing training a minimum once a year or more often and documenting that. Next slide. And then probably one of the biggest components of a biosecurity plan is identifying a perimeter buffer area and line of separation. So these are terms that you might hear a lot when talking about biosecurity. Sometimes we shorten it to PBA or LOLs. But this is a good example of a map of a farm with multiple houses, and they've designated um, multiple things, but specifically the perimeter buffer area. So that's going to be that kind of lighter blue line going all around the outer edge of this farm. And so you can kind of think of that as like sort of the outer moat of an overall castle. So this is kind of outer that outer perimeter area that people or animals or different things shouldn't have direct access. So making sure there's one specific entry point to a premises or a facility, having a designated parking area, it's meaning that everyone's kind of having to funnel through one area and you can actually monitor who's coming on and off of a premises. Are they following appropriate protocols? So that's kind of a loose perimeter. And then the line of separation, which on this map is designated, you can see they've designated each barn to sort of be its own little containment facility. And then the orange line is that access point getting into the line of separation. And I kind of think of this as just that direct entry or direct line between sort of the outside world and then the inside world, and thinking of whatever you're putting in that line of separation, that's just sort of its own containment unit. And everything that goes in, it can only go in a certain way and only go out a certain way. So this would be where you would have your specific entry procedures, whether it's a Dutch entry system, a foot bath, or PPE, changing clothes, whatever that looks like for that specific facility, this is where that would take place. And so this is also an example of what we would want to see demonstrated in an enhanced or a site-specific biosecurity plan. So when we're talking about permitted movement, controlled movement, and essentially being able to demonstrate your enhanced plan for that specific site, this is at minimum what we would want to see, because it shows us that you have a plan in place for how people, trucks, everything is coming onto a farm, how things move through a facility, and making sure you have these critical access points, that you're making sure people are following appropriate biosecurity plans. And again, on that biosecurity website that we have the links to, it also has resources for how to create or develop a map just like this. You can go to the next slide. Um, yeah, personnel. So this is a big one as well in thinking about your site-specific biosecurity plan, because really people are probably one of the biggest risks risks for a disease introduction to your farm. And so the personnel portion of your plan should address procedures and biosecurity, PPE for site dedicated, as well as non-farm personnel. So having a plan for people who are going to be on site every day, such as your growers, your caretakers, technicians, but also just non-farm people or visitors. Again, those entry and exit procedures are really important for this. So identifying how are people going to gain access to the overall premises, but as well as to each specific barn or building on site. This picture here is kind of an example of a Dutch entry system. So you can see on the right, there is a single door, so single access. And then in this system, an employee or someone visiting would take off their outer clothing. They would leave behind any unnecessary equipment like watches or jewelry. There's a foot bath. They would take off their shoes that have been in the outside world, sit on this bench, turn around, and then they're essentially in the clean side of this line. And then they would put on fresh PPE, new clean boots that have only been inside this barn. There's a wash station for hands, and then again, another foot bath and one access point into the barn. And then the exit procedure would be similar. That doesn't have to be as extensive as this. It could be just a foot bath, just new boots, disposable footwear or disposable outerwear. But this is a really good system to kind of establish a very good clean, dirty line and a line of separation going into a barn. And then movement logs are really important to just keep track of who's coming on and off of a site. So, and there are templates for these as well on that website to help keep track of visitors. Feed delivery is really important because we know there's trucks coming on and off of farms all the time. Keeping track of maintenance, technicians, other animal transport trucks. So when you're moving eggs, bringing in restock poultry, or moving things to slaughter. And this is not all inclusive, but just examples of typical movements on and off in farm and what you would want to be able to document and keep track of. So at any given time, you know who's been on site that day. Next slide. Keeping track of wild birds, pests, rodents. This is really important because we do know, especially with HPAI, that wild birds are the reservoir and can spread disease very easily. So just having a good plan in place, but also keeping track of it. So this is an example of someone who could keep track of doing visual inspections, any major changes to rodents or pests, what's being done to mitigate any risks. So having um, rodent bait is a pretty common option, but making sure they're replenished, that they're in appropriate places for wild birds, really doing a good inspection of the barn and any holes that may be up, especially at that sort of where the roof meets the walls. It can be really easy to get little holes up there that little birds might want to nest or can get inside. So just being able to monitor and keep track and put any prevention measures in place to prevent wild bird or other rodents that might be coming in. Next slide.
Are you able to see it?
Yes, I can see it. Okay, so equipment and vehicles, again, thinking about people and movement of things on and off of a farm as probably the biggest risks to disease introduction or spread. This is a really important point to know how are you going to monitor these, and what are you doing to prevent any risks that those might be bringing to your farm? So your biosecurity plan should include procedures for how you would clean and disinfect equipment and vehicles, or it may just say that you restrict sharing of equipment. So probably the most enhanced or most strict type of biosecurity plan would just say that there's absolutely no sharing of equipment, that trucks or vehicles only visit one premises per day. They don't go from farm to farm, but that's not always feasible. So if that is happening, making sure that you have a very detailed plan for how you're going to clean and disinfect. So ideally, cleaning and disinfecting trucks when they come onto a farm, when they leave it, and especially before they go to a different one. Now, again, this may not be your everyday biosecurity principles, um, but this would be an enhanced biosecurity. And this is what we're looking for when we're doing permitted movement or you're in a quarantine or control area. Also, making sure to document vehicle access and traffic patterns. That's really important. Ideally, just having one in and out way off of a farm so that you know who's coming on, you know when they've left, and if you need to do a clean and dirty line, you sort of have that central access point. Again, any equipment that crosses the perimeter buffer area or the line of separation should be clean and disinfected. Next slide. I think there may just be a delay between when you advance, Dr. Beatty, and when I see them. There we go. Okay. So mortality disposal, and manure management, this is a really big one as well. So ideally, mortality should be collected daily, not only to prevent potential disease spread, because potentially whatever that bird has died from, you don't want that sitting around in a barn with healthy birds, but also it helps you keep track of if there's any concern for a new disease outbreak. But then knowing where you're going to store or dispose those mortalities is really important too. We do not want it to attract wild birds or buzzards or other scavengers. So making sure that it's stored in a really well-maintained area with strict access. Additionally, traffic flow that minimizes the potential for cross-contamination between different structures or other facilities. So identifying on a map how those mortalities are collected and then stored. So ideally, you would want to go into a single barn, collect mortalities, and then go straight to where you store those rather than going from barn to barn to barn, because again, you could potentially be contaminating all of your barns with something that's only going on in one of them. And again, that may not be your everyday practice, but in an enhanced biosecurity plan, this is the type of thing we'd be looking for. Also making sure that rendering trucks that may be going to multiple sites do not cross that perimeter buffer area. And so one way to kind of help mitigate that would be having your collection container straddle the perimeter buffer area. So you can see the diagram on the right, they've implemented this. So they've put their line of separation around all of their barns with one single access point, but then they also can identify sort of the traffic flow on the premises, but they put their dead bird collection sort of on the line there. So people can be collecting mortalities, placing them in the container, and they're staying within that perimeter buffer area. They're not leaving it. but then a truck could come and just collect it and never have to cross that line. So that's a good way to kind of prevent cross contamination, maybe minimize the amount of cleaning and disinfecting you're doing. If there's a way to um, sort of decrease how many times or how much a truck or a vehicle is having to actually cross those lines and coming onto the facility, that's going to decrease some of the cleaning and disinfection, decrease time it takes to move things, and just decrease overall risk. Next slide, please. Replacement poultry. So it seems kind of obvious, but just something to keep in mind. Obviously, we want to source that replacement poultry from healthy flocks that are ideally NPIP monitored, or at least are in compliance with NPIP guidelines. This is something that most people do, so we don't really about it a whole lot. But if we're doing a biosecurity audit and a response, or approving permits, this is something that we may ask is, where are these replacement poultry coming from? And again, as part of the movement of, bringing in day-old chicks, taking spent hens to slaughter, or moving eggs around, we want to see a really detailed plan for how you're going to clean and disinfect the transport equipment or vehicles. And again, an all-in, all-out system is ideal. It decreases the risk of disease introduction when you have different ages on the same premises. Poultry are susceptible to different diseases based on different ages, but also the more you're bringing in new sets of chicks or poultry, that's always an increased risk for bringing something in. We understand this can't always be implemented, but again, that's why you should have that site-specific plan. So if you're not able to do an all in, all out, you're going to potentially have different ages on site, just detailing what are you going to do to sort of counteract that disease risk. Next slide. So water, making sure that there's clean drinking water, but making sure that it's the actual equipment is clean as well, knowing your water source, testing and treating as needed to eliminate any potential contamination. Feed and replacement litter is another one to think about. Having a plan. Feed deliveries occur quite often on a premises. So every time that feed's being delivered, or old feed might be removed, or old litter might be removed, again, that's a potential disease introduction, or that's a risk that something could happen. So knowing how the litter or the feed's being stored, again, keeping track of the movements, knowing how often they're coming on or off, potentially having a way for them to deliver feed without maybe ever going into the perimeter buffer area, or maybe having a way for that truck driver to never get out of the truck. So that can decrease your risks. Having a way to clean and disinfect them as they come on and off the property. And then if feed is spilled, because that can attract wild birds and rodents and other animals, having a plan that dictates how quickly you'll clean that up or take care of that. And then, of course, keeping track of morbidity and mortality. This is just to, keep track of any potential disease introduction that might be going on, but also gives a good idea of how well the biosecurity plan is in place. So having in your plan what is an increased or more than expected number of mortalities, and knowing when and how to report. So this is also just saying that, someone should be going into these barns, walking them at least every day to make sure that not only are all the biosecurity aspects in place, but is there a concern that we're seeing increased mortalities than usual. Next slide. And so what I've talked about so far mimics the MPIP biosecurity requirements, but has gone into a little bit more detail. And so having an enhanced biosecurity plan, that is what we would want to look for if you are in a control area, if we're trying to approve permitted movements, um, or if, you are the infected farm. So that's a bit separate from if you're just in MPIP. There's also a biosecurity plan requirement to be a part of that program. So that's a little bit separate than just this enhanced biosecurity we've been talking about, even though they cover a lot of the same topics. And so if you're a part of MPIP, you do get audited at least once every 2 years. That's overseen by the OSA, and usually someone from TDA or potentially someone from USDA are doing these audits. And it's mostly just a summary report saying if things are satisfactory or unsatisfactory. And on the right, you can see an example of that template. And so the MPIP program audit is more or less a checklist of making sure that all of these 14 points are being followed, but it's not a detailed plan. So that's why when we talk about control areas, quarantines, and especially approving permits to move things in and out of a control zone, we say we need to see documentation or evidence of an actual biosecurity plan in place. The MPIP program is not enough because this is kind of the basic everyday requirements. We're wanting to see detailed plans for how you're putting these into place. And that needs to be a written site-specific document. And then biosecurity plans would also be required for hatcheries and feed mills as part of MPIP, but they would also be required to demonstrate their plan if they are part of a control zone as well. Next slide.
I'm going to jump in here. We are getting ready to move into movement and permitting. This is Dr. Beatty. I'm going to say that we do audit companies every 2 years, usually going to different complexes and looking at their overall biosecurity plan requirements. And just from observation, all of these things can be demonstrated in fairly granular detail for the company, right? So the company has a biosecurity coordinator. They do have people who train. And so I guess we can even say, can you demonstrate to us where this farm has been, has had a biosecurity plan developed? I think biosecurity from a 40,000 foot view is covered very much, as Dr. Smart had said. I think, you can get into what I have seen is very granular detail on hatcheries and feed mills, which is excellent. I think that there may be a gap between biosecurity plans for the company and what the actual producer may be implementing. And so I'll highlight that just a little bit by saying, when we look at how high-path avian influenza is transmitted and the differences in outbreaks over the years, looking at 2015, that event, we saw a lot of lateral transmission. People were moving the virus because of the lack of biosecurity practice. Certainly, the wild bird population was not as infected at that point in time as we're seeing now in 22, 23, where our wild bird population is very prone or subject to be infected, and then they are actually dropping the virus from the skies, for lack of a better analogy. So if you have multiple barns on a premises and your company policy is that you change boots between barns, it's important that the producer on the ground level is adhering to that policy. Whether it's a lack of implementation or a lack of understanding, I think that's one of the things that we've seen with our disease outbreaks. Also, just a lack of awareness that there's even an issue sometimes in the area. So making sure that producers are aware that we're at a heightened risk, whatever that looks like for your company, whether that's an all hazards alert or you're at the red level, or however you designate increased risk of disease. And that's when the enhanced biosecurity needs to come in play. making sure that people understand now's the time that I've got to try to prevent this disease from being transmitted into my barns. And so there are really two pretty critical components, like what do I live in peacetime and what do I live in the midst of an outbreak. And if you're in a control zone, we're going to have very specific expectations for you. But at the same time, those expectations may not be a bad idea to voluntarily implement, just knowing that you're in the flyway where birds are moving, and making sure that, you know, people are aware that they're doing everything that they can to, you know, use boot covers or whatever that looks like. That may be a small thing, but could really prevent a lot of heartache along the way. Someone did contact our field reimbursement specialist in the last couple of weeks to ask about, you know, how does indemnity work? And I think those are great questions, but the person actually said, you know, do we get 100% reimbursement for what we're losing? And I think the answer to that, if you think about the greater scheme of the outbreak, is no. You will never be made whole if you are involved or an infected premises, because by the time you consider the cleaning and the disinfection and how long you're left out of commerce, certainly indemnity eases the pain, but it's not going to replace the lost income, and the lost commerce. So I want to offer our support for biosecurity planning. If you have questions about that, you need help implementing biosecurity plans or developing them, please reach out to our office. We would be glad to work with you to try to get that accomplished. It is certainly much easier to do now while we're not in the middle of an outbreak than it is to have to, you know, rush and implement in the midst of an outbreak. So yeah, just wanted to briefly hit on that. And I don't see any questions in the chat. I'll pause for a moment to see if there are any questions from the crowd. All right. So we have gotten to a stopping point. If we want to go ahead, we'll take a lunch break, and then we're going to come back in an hour and hit on movement and permitting, if that is agreeable with everyone.